Good afternoon. I'm Kenny Irby, senior faculty member here at the Poynter Institute, and we're here to talk about the photojournalism winners for the Pulitzer Prizes in the breaking news and the feature photography categories. Overall, I don't think there's any real surprise here. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch is no surprise for its 14 plus days of rioting and unrest in the aftermath of Michael Brown's death. In the city of Ferguson is no surprise. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch did just a phenomenal job of coverage of the broad range of the experiences that were happening publicly and in homes and in businesses, in the lives of citizens in that Ferguson community. The feature category I think is a little bit of a twist, not a surprise, because it was probably the largest and most covered story of the year, the Ebola outbreak in Africa. And Daniel Berhuluk, actually independent photojournalist for the New York Times, won not in the spot news category, but in feature photography. And this was largely because the project was approached as a continuing saga and the coverage of the caregivers and medical workers, as well as those who were in the communities in Sierra Leone who were devastated by this disease, this virus. So we'll take a look at some of the photographs and talk about some of the unique aspects of composition and insight and access, which leads to great photojournalism. Doing some research today, talking with folks in the newsroom, I learned that the St. Louis Post-Dispatch covered all their bases. They entered 3 photo entries, one as a staff entry that ultimately was awarded the coveted prize, and 2 single photographs, which are also, according to the guidelines, acceptable in this process. They were entered as single images, and rarely in this day and age, in the 20th, latter part of the 20th century into the 21st century, has a single image won for the spontaneous news or breaking news category. The team staff entry represents just a wonderful series of images that, as I alluded to, walk through the early days of August 13th when the unrest started. There is the iconic photograph by Robert Cohen of the young man wearing the American flag T-shirt, throwing the tear gas canister back. It's just an amazing alignment of action and color and symmetry and symbolism, actually, in this photograph. The entry also shows Michael Brown's mother and the family grieving. So the story immediately goes from the tragedy to the trauma and the drama of the story. The staff just really pulled together, and they covered every element that you would expect to have in the story. And what I'm most pleased to see and be able to report is that there are some surprises, that they moved away from the public spectacle of protest and actually got behind the scenes in a lot of their coverage. Many of the themes that were articulated and written about and captured on audio were actually taken to another context in the photographs, in terms of hands up, don't shoot, which became a rhetorical theme. They actually did put their lives on the line in terms of many of the scenarios that unfolded. They armed themselves with bulletproof vests and helmets and riot gear, and actually went into some of the looting to place themselves, to give you a bird's eye view. And that was meritorious and courageous, in addition to adding to the photographic and journalistic excellence. Here in this series of photographs, Dave Carlson actually went inside and had some encounters himself with protesters and looters. J.B. Forbes was actually also integral to the coverage and showing the juxtapositions of the police, law enforcement, and the protesters. I think one of the things that the world saw for the first time in the Ferguson coverage was that it appeared to be not just a riot zone, but a war zone. And that came across profoundly in the photographs with the fire and the tear gas, and then the heavily militarized police department being juxtaposed against the protesters. Who were equally as violent in many of their Molotov cocktail tossing and the indiscriminate shooting that actually took place. And in every instance of each of the things that we're describing, the Post-Dispatch was there. And they went back to the scene and they photographed and documented the continuously building of the memorial to Michael Brown. That was quite touching as people came from all over the country to share flowers and teddy bears and to contribute to the memorials. And then ultimately the perspective on the funeral from Robert Cohen, the overhead view, was just a wonderfully composed image that showed the pageantry and the sorrow of the experience. So Robert Cohen's contributions were definitely integral to the photo coverage and the package. But it was a total team effort as Lyndon Steele, the director of photography, and Gary Harrelson, the director of videography, all shared with me insights as they were going through this experience. They were rotating photographers in, trying to get people rest and preparing them to go back and continue this ongoing coverage. There were several photographs that were surprisingly haunting that took us back to a period in the 60s and 70s. There was this photograph by David Carson that showed the tugging on the American flag that was wildly reminiscent of a photograph from Stan Forman in Boston after the busing on Faneuil Hall, where a black man was being stabbed with a flag by a Caucasian protester. And so these images show a very haunting and ugly picture of Americans' history as it relates to race. Some of the images that showed the eeriness of the night, where folks were carrying firearms and trying to protect themselves, were well documented. Most of the violence, all of the violence in particular, happened at night, and so it was quite a challenge to document and cover this story. And then ultimately the closing image that showed the aftermath of the burnout beauty supply shop was a very fitting end to. It was more of a comma, not a period, on a major story in American history.